So the current Chief Secretary to the Treasury has assured me that there has been a restoration of the normal protocols of interaction. I will hold him to that, because it is vital that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, and my colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland are just as livid about this as I am, I might add, that we are properly engaged with to ensure that we can put forward the concerns and the views of members of Parliament, and particularly constituents such as those of Ms Ewing that she's put to me today.
And brief supplementary, Paul Swinney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Deputy First Minister has mentioned his engagement with the UK Government, but I was disappointed to learn recently there has been minimal engagement from Scottish ministers on the development of the UK National Shipbuilding Strategy and the refresh of that. Would the Deputy First Minister please commit to having the Scottish Government engaging fully with that strategy, given that we are the second biggest purchaser of vessels in the public sector outside the Ministry of Defence, and we need to get this right. When those vessels are awarded to Turkey, it's a failure for Scottish industry.
I'm very happy to commit to dialogue on any aspect of strategy that affects the industrial base of Scotland or any other question in Scotland. But I respectfully point out to Mr Swinney there has not been a functioning United Kingdom government for the best part of 12 months. It literally has not functioned. Interaction has been appalling. Dialogue one way. There has been no decision-making coming back from the UK Government, and what decision-making they've undertaken, as Mr Swinney and I will agree, in the mini-budget was catastrophic. So I hope we've got some degree of functioning government in the United Kingdom Government to allow us to advance the very legitimate issue that Mr Swinney puts to me this afternoon.
Question number 6, Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what support it is providing to businesses in the hospitality sector in light of the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis.
Minister Tom Arthur.
The hospitality sector is vital to Scotland's economy. We provided over £4.7 billion in support to businesses during the pandemic, including across the tourism and hospitality sector, and are closely monitoring impacts of the cost crisis. We are also establishing a tourism and hospitality industry leadership group to drive sustainable long-term recovery. We maintain competitive non-domestic rates, delivering the lowest non-domestic rates poundage in the UK for the 4th consecutive year, supporting a package of non-domestic rates reliefs worth £801 million. In light of increased pressures and limited powers, we will continue to press the UK Government for support.
Fulton McGregor.
I thank the Minister for that response. During the recent October recess, I was invited to meet with a number of pub owners from Coatbridge Main Street who expressed a real concern about the viability of their businesses in the short term due to the cost of living crisis, rising energy costs and changes in behaviour following the pandemic. One of these, the Eden Group, who employ nearly 100 people in my constituency, were also in the national newspaper this weekend. The Minister might have seen that. They are calling on the Chancellor to cut VAT immediately, offer rates assistance and provide some form of recovery funding. Would the Minister agree with these calls on the UK Government and lend his voice to them?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, we understand that businesses such as the Eden Group, operating in Fulton McGregor's constituency, continue to face significant challenges, including the longer-term impact of the pandemic and cost crisis, and we do not underestimate the scale of these challenges. That is why my colleague, the Deputy First Minister, wrote to Jeremy Hunt, the new Chancellor, on 19 October to re-emphasise the need for targeted support for households and businesses funded by windfall gains in the energy sector, and seeking clarity on the support that will be available from April 2023. We will continue to work with businesses in Scotland to press the UK Government for a range of measures to help ease the current pressures, including on VAT and recovery support.
Supplementary, Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, President Officer. The Audit Scotland report called on Scotland's financial response to COVID this year stated that 100% of the £4.5 billion of Barnett consequentials related to business support was allocated. But can the Minister tell me how much of the £4.5 million was allocated to funds but not spent? And is that money now available to help businesses who are struggling right now?
Minister.
We have committed all COVID consequences for business support that we received during the pandemic to support businesses. I missed some of the detail of the members' questions, but I will be happy to consult the official report and get back to him in writing if there was anything I missed in the points that he made.
And question 7, Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what support it is providing to small businesses through the cost of living crisis.
Mr Richard Lockhead.
We understand the challenges facing small businesses, which have been exacerbated by the economic upheaval caused by the UK Government in recent weeks. We have in place an existing package of non-domestic rates reliefs worth over £800 million, which includes the UK's most generous small business bonus scheme. However, the powers and resources required to tackle this crisis, of course, lie with the UK Government, and we will continue to press them to do everything possible to help Scotland's small businesses.
Faisal Chowdhury.
I thank the Minister for that answer, and I refer members to my entry of the register of interest. I have already been contacted by business owners within the Lothian region, particularly in the restaurant businesses, who have been operating for decades, but now find themselves having to close for good thanks to the perfect storm of COVID, a staffing crisis, and now the cost of living crisis too. As we see this happening across multiple sectors at once, does the Scottish Government share my fear that we may have preserved our economy through the worst of the COVID pandemic, only to see it hollowed out by this latest crisis?
Minister.
I can assure Faisal Chowdhury that we absolutely share his fears and his concerns in relation to the impact of the current cost of living crisis and rising energy bills on Scotland's small businesses in Lothian and throughout the country. And I should say that Faisal Chowdhury and myself and some others in the Chamber were at the Asian Catering Awards dinner last night, where we enjoyed not only some fantastic curry and some good company, but we also heard from numerous small businesses in the hospitality sector and the catering sector, the restaurants, of the enormous challenges they are facing at the current time with rocketing energy bills, bills for ingredients and other costs. And this is a very, very serious situation. And the First Minister, of course, wrote as recently as the 27th of October to the new Prime Minister, stressing the urgent need for clarity on what support will remain available for non-domestic consumers beyond April. And we have committed to working with the business sector to explore how businesses can be supported with their energy costs within our devolved powers, and we are supporting Business Energy Scotland, and businesses should contact Business Energy Scotland for advice, and we will do everything else within our powers.
Very brief supplementary, Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Many small businesses in Scotland are facing substantial pressures, as has been said. So, can the Minister provide any update as to the Scottish Government's latest engagement with the UK Government regarding support available to small businesses to deal with this rising cost?
As briefly as possible, Minister.
I just reiterate to Bill Kidd, who makes many perfectly powerful points and valid points, that the First Minister, of course, has just written to the new Prime Minister about these issues, and we await a response and hopefully a positive reply. And I have no doubt that the Deputy First Minister will address some of these issues in his forthcoming statement.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes portfolio questions. We move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by John Swinney on the emergency budget review. The Deputy First Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interruptions or interventions. And I call on John Swinney, Deputy First Minister, for around 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, Scotland is facing a cost of living crisis. A combination of the impacts of Brexit, the aftermath of the pandemic and the energy crisis fuelled by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine have sent prices spiralling. Inflation is at a 40-year high, and the pressure on the finances of households and businesses is acute. Public services are facing demands, entirely legitimate demands, to make significantly enhanced pay offers to their staff. As a government, we have a duty to respond, but our ability to respond is limited by the inactivity of the United Kingdom Government and the financial restrictions of devolution. The Scottish Government budget is largely fixed. We have no ability to borrow to increase our day-to-day spending. Our reserve funding is fully utilised, and our income tax powers do not allow changes to be made during the financial year. In August, we announced that we would undertake an emergency budget review to identify every possible penny to support the people of Scotland through the cost of living crisis, while maintaining a pathway to balance the budget. On the 7th of September, I set out to Parliament the first of the hard prioritisation choices already made, and today I provide a further update on our progress through the emergency budget review process. Since September, this crisis has deepened further. The inactivity of the UK Government gave way to calamity. The United Government's mini-budget sent shockwaves through the markets, driving up borrowing costs for government, businesses and households. So disastrous was the package of unfunded and uncosted tax cuts for the rich that not only did the mini-budget not survive the month, but neither did its architects, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. The utterly needless upheaval has created significant damage for individuals and great uncertainty for Scotland's finances. Initially, the Scottish Government was told that we would receive an additional £660 million through the block grant adjustment. Now, with the new Chancellor scrapping the plan to cut the basic rate of income tax in the rest of the United Kingdom, our funding will be reduced by £230 million over the period of the UK spending review. This represents a swing of almost £900 million in the space of less than a month. Now, under a new Prime Minister and a new Chancellor, calamity is giving way to austerity, with deep spending cuts expected. As members will be aware, I had intended to present the outcome of the emergency budget review to Parliament last week, but paused that announcement while we awaited the fiscal statement of the 31st of October. However, that date has now changed to the 17th of November. While I would have preferred to see the OBR forecast and the outcome of the UK statement prior to publishing this review, I have concluded that we can wait no longer. The scale of the challenge is so severe and the impacts and uncertainties for people, households and businesses so significant that the imperative consideration must be to provide as much stability, certainty and transparency as possible. We now also once again face the prospect of tax changes from the UK Government. It is only right then that we take the appropriate time and care to consider any impacts on our budget and devolved tax policies. So I will wait until after the UK Government's next fiscal statement before deciding on the content of any tax discussion paper. Presiding Officer, I cannot overstate the degree of challenge associated with undertaking this emergency budget review. I have said before that in all of my experience, now and during my previous tenure as Finance Secretary, there has never been a time of greater pressure on the public finances. Inflation means that our annual budget today is worth £1.7 billion less than when it was published last December. At the same time, demand for government support and intervention is understandably increasing. I must balance the books, but I am committed to doing so in a way that prioritises funding to help families, to back business, to provide fair pay awards and to protect the delivery of public services. This emergency budget review delivers on these objectives. This Government is determined to enhance pay and target support to the lowest paid where possible, as a crucial part of our response to the cost of living crisis. This support includes offers in the region of 7% for frontline workers in the local government non-teacher and NHS Agenda for Change workforces. This would increase salaries for the lowest paid staff in Agenda for Change by over 11%. Although some pay negotiations have still to conclude, I have already committed over £700 million of additional resources to fund enhanced pay settlements. I am grateful for the efforts of employers and trade unions to facilitate these vital collective bargaining processes. But to be absolutely clear, every additional penny for pay has had to be found from existing, previously allocated and agreed budgets elsewhere within the current finite Scottish budget. We have reached the limit of what can be done in terms of reprioritisation. Presiding Officer, when I set out the initial package of £560 million in savings in 2022-23, I was clear that additional savings would still be required. Today, I have published an emergency budget review that sets out a further £615 million in savings. This includes £400 million from reprioritisation of spend within health and social care to provide a fair pay offer for NHS staff and to meet the extraordinary pressures from inflation and demand as the service begins to recover from the pandemic. This has included rephasing some social care spending in line with expected spending profiles and repurposing spend in other areas such as mental health. Despite this, we continue to progress our work to deliver a national care service, as well as commitments to fair work and adult social care, and we continue to provide overall increases to mental health spending, as well as delivery of dementia, learning disability and autism services and cross-cutting trauma work. These are extraordinarily difficult choices, which no government wishes to have to make, but the full balance of health and social care reprioritisation will remain within the portfolio. A further £33 million of resource savings and £180 million of capital reductions have also been made, including reducing our marketing expenditure to below pre-COVID levels. Taken together, these decisions and those already set out in September total almost £1.2 billion. They are not decisions we would wish to make, but in the absence of additional funding from the UK Government, they are decisions that we are compelled to make. They ensure a path to a balanced budget, whilst also prioritising fair public sector pay offers and recognising that this is critical to the delivery of key public services. This Government will also always do what we can to support those most affected by the cost of living crisis. I can confirm that we have identified and allocated the resources required to double the value of the December Scottish Child Bridging Payment, benefiting around 145,000 school-aged children registered to receive free school meals, to double the Fuel Insecurity Fund to £20 million, to increase funding to local authorities for additional discretionary housing payment support to mitigate the UK Government's benefit cap as fully as possible within our devolved powers, to introduce a new £1.4 million Island Cost Crisis Emergency Fund, to introduce new payment break options to help protect those who have taken control of debt through the highly successful Debt Arrangement Scheme, and to implement reforms to remove cost burdens for the most financially vulnerable. In our efforts to support business, we have also looked closely at regulation and how we can make it easier for businesses to thrive, and we have used today's review to set out a range of improvements. After extensive engagement with business organisations, industry groups and individual businesses, and including industry summits on energy and financial services, we will introduce a range of measures set out in the emergency budget review today, and those include building on the additional £300,000 provided to Business Energy Scotland this year by doubling the energy efficiency cashback element of the loan and cashback scheme to £20,000, protecting the Small Business Bonus Scheme, the most generous scheme in the UK, which takes over 111,000 businesses out of rates altogether, and establishing a joint task force with COSLA, local authorities and our regulatory agencies in business to consider the differing impacts of regulation on business. Presiding Officer, alongside our counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland, we have repeatedly called on the UK Government to do more, given the considerably greater flexibility available to the UK Government. The First Minister reiterated these calls to the latest Prime Minister, highlighting the essential need to provide further targeted financial support to low-income households, urgently provide clarity on what support will remain available for both non-domestic consumers and households following the early end to the energy price guarantee next March, and to make additional funding available so that devolved governments can support people, provide fair public sector pay uplifts and protect public services. The First Minister has also reiterated our deep concern about the risk of social security benefits not being increased with inflation in April. A permanent £25 uplift to universal credit should be introduced now, alongside the reversal of the two-child limit for universal credit and tax credits and the abolition of the benefit cap. We have been clear that an enhanced windfall tax should fund this support in place of increased borrowing or spending cuts. We are now anticipating a package of eye-watering cuts and tax rises in the autumn statement. It will be evident to all members that the emergency budget review has involved extremely difficult decisions. Even when such decisions need to be made quickly, as is the case now, I believe it is essential that we use the best available evidence and also be as transparent as possible. To that end, I would like to thank the members of our expert panel for the consideration and advice that they have provided over recent weeks, and which I also published today. The panel has assessed the outlook that faces the Scottish Government in its budget and advised the Government to proceed with caution to achieve its objectives in these difficult days. In addition, I published a new analytical report on the impact of the cost of living crisis in Scotland, alongside a high-level summary of the evidence around the equality and fairness impacts of the emergency budget review measures. The outlook for 23-24 and beyond is clearly even more difficult than when we set out the resource spending review earlier this year, and measures for efficiency and reform in the delivery of our public services will be even more important. Nonetheless, I can assure Parliament that this Government remains firmly committed and focused on continuing to support our public service recovery from the impacts of COVID, on tackling and reducing child poverty, of taking forward our net zero ambitions and supporting strong and sustainable growth in our country.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. The Deputy First Minister will now take questions on issues raised in his statement. I know we've slightly overrun, but I still intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll need to move to the next item of business. I would, though, encourage members and indeed the Cabinet Secretary to be as succinct as possible in questions and answers. And for those who haven't already done so, could you please press your request to speak buttons if you wish to ask a question. I now call on Liz Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight, and can I also acknowledge the difficult circumstances in which the Scottish Government finds itself. Some of them obviously are international, some of them have been domestic, and I fully acknowledge that part of the difficulty is the timing of the forecasts and of the budget. And these difficulties are substantial for the Cabinet Secretary, and I fully understand why he can't say a bit more about tax policy just now. Now, the Cabinet Secretary is always challenging the opposition parties, quite rightly so, to come up with budget suggestions of their own. So here is one, and he refers to this at the bottom of page 2, and that is regarding health and social care. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, does he really think that now is the appropriate time for his government to be proceeding with a National Care Service bill, which has drawn so much criticism from virtually every stakeholder and which Audit Scotland is predicting to be costing £1.3 billion? Secondly, he has outlined further cuts to health, to education, to justice. Can I ask why there have been no further cuts to the Constitution budget? And thirdly, he's outlined some measures that he's agreed with business. I think it's on page 3. But can he tell us what specific measures will be put in place to boost productivity, which, as he confirmed himself at Finance Committee, is a serious issue and which undermines the tax take in Scotland?
Deputy First Minister.
I think the complete sentence that Liz Smith was trying to get out at the beginning of her contribution was to acknowledge the difficulties created for me by the decisions of the United Kingdom, as well as the timing decisions. So I think we should just allow me to just complete that sentence for Liz Smith. In relation to the National Care Service, it is a situation where we have a very high level of delayed discharge within our hospital system, which is creating enormous strain in the delivery of national health services. We have to recognise and acknowledge the necessity of reform, because the current arrangements are not working. We therefore have to take the steps to establish a national care service for two reasons: to ensure that members of the public are assured in all parts of the country about the quality and the range of care that will be available to them, and secondly, to ensure that we are able to support the sustainability of the National Health Service. That is why that expenditure is required. Now, on the Constitution budget, I suspect what that was code for was expressing the commitment of the Government to spend £20 million on a referendum on independence. I point out to Liz Smith that expenditure does not arise in this current financial year, and it's this current financial year that I am wrestling with to its greatest extent. And lastly, in relation to productivity, I have announced a set of savings that have been made here today. I am also at the same time protecting very, very significant levels of public expenditure in skills, in our universities, in our college sector, to ensure that we can invest in developing the capability of individuals in our society to maximise their economic contribution. But what would be the biggest single thing that would help productivity in this country is if we had a sensible approach to population growth and migration. And that has been abruptly halted for us by the total folly of Brexit. So if I can appeal to Liz Smith and the Conservatives about anything, the Health Secretary points out social care. The social care sector has lost thousands of employees because of Brexit. So we need to have a sensible discussion about migration, because the The behaviour of the Conservative Government, especially of the Home Secretary in recent days, is directly undermining productivity in the Scottish economy.
I would encourage the Cabinet Secretary to ignore sedentary interventions, either from his own bench or indeed the opposition benches. I call Daniel Johnson.
Deputy Presiding Officer, can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and where there are additional measures on the cost of living, can I welcome them. But there is no doubt the chaos emanating from the UK Government make a challenging situation that much more difficult. But in turn, I think that underlines the need for clarity and transparency from governments, be they Scottish or UK. So can I ask, proportionately, which portfolios have the largest savings to make against the budget passed earlier this year in order to achieve the £1.175 billion worth of cuts announced? As confirmed by the Fiscal Commission in paragraph 34 of their May forecast, the Scottish Government had planned to carry forward £279 million from this year's budget to next and £250 million to 24-25 using the reserve. Is that still the case? And if not, how have those sums been allocated, and what are the impacts on next year's budget and the following? And I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary agrees that we must all tighten our belts, but I note that the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs has travelled to 8 countries in as many months, clocking up almost 22,000 air miles. So what cost control measures are being applied to the expenditures of members of the Government and civil servants?
Cabinet Secretary. Deputy First Minister.
I think the steps that the Government is taking about clarity and transparency, I think, are evident by the fact that I'm here today and that I appeared before the Finance Committee several weeks ago on the subject at a session chaired by Mr Johnson, and I also appeared in Parliament in early September to explain openly the changes and the choices that I was making. So I think on the question of transparency, this Government is delivering on what would be expected by the public. What I've tried to do, I've not approached this from the perspective of applying a random reduction across portfolios. What I've had to do is to look at this very advanced stage in the financial year at what options remain available to me to reprioritise spending. And in some areas of government activity, there is more scope to do that than in others. In the case of the changes in relation to health and social care, I was absolutely clear with the Health Secretary and the Health Portfolio that whatever savings we were able to identify would be retained within the Health and Social Care portfolio to support the very strong pay offer that has been made, particularly for low-income staff. In relation to the reserve, we've carried forward the resources from the last financial year into this year that we planned. Obviously, the budget for next year was predicated in the resource spending review on a carryover from this year to next year. I have yet to identify those resources. That remains an ongoing challenge before the end of the financial year, and I am still working to ensure I can balance the budget this year, which is my statutory duty to do so. And lastly, on the question of the international engagement of the Government, we're a Government that we can't be insular. We've got to be in contact with the rest of the world. I'm quite sure it's really important that we maintain that dialogue. The Prime Minister was being criticised just yesterday for not going to COP27. I'm delighted he's now going. So I think international dialogue is essential for every single government, including the Scottish Government.
Could I encourage members not just to listen to the questions but also to listen to the answers? Can I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Kenneth Gibson?
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Make no mistake, we're here in large part because of the calamitous decisions by the Conservative Government. They've added hundreds of pounds to people's mortgages, and it is unforgivable. That's why we need a general election. But the choices this Government have made are manifestly wrong as well. Irrespective of when that £20 million is allocated for, we're still spending civil service time and money on the production of constitutional papers, £17 million on national testing every year, and up to £1 billion on the ministerial takeover of social care. All the while, councils are being squeezed to the pits, long COVID sufferers continue to struggle without, and £38 million is being stripped from mental health. On this last point, can I ask the Deputy First Minister what has changed in the severity of the national mental health crisis that he can find that level of money to cut from the mental health budget?
Deputy First Minister.
So let me address two particular points that Mr Cole-Hamilton raises. First of all, in relation to local authorities. Local authorities will be getting significantly more resources as a consequence of the reprioritisation exercises I have gone through to support very strong pay deals that are assisting local government employees on low incomes. And I'm sure that's something that Mr Cole-Hamilton would welcome. In relation to the question on mental health, I acknowledge the significance of the questions around mental health. Indeed, in my dialogue with the Health Secretary, we have both been determined to ensure that we protect the mental health services as much as we possibly can do. So what has been announced today will mean that the resources allocated to mental health are not increasing as fast as we had planned. They will still be growing, but they will not be growing as fast as we had hoped. Now, I'm not going to suggest or to minimise the significance of that decision, but it comes about because I have limited options at this stage in the financial year, and it's an indication of anything else to any Member of Parliament of the severity of the situation that we face in public expenditure terms that I'm having to take decisions of that type. As I said in my statement, I would prefer not to be taking those decisions, but I have to do that to fulfil my duty to balance our resources in a financial year, and also to make sure I can support employees, particularly in low incomes, in dealing with the cost of living crisis that they all face.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Deputy First Minister agree that the emergency budget review is stark about the difficulties caused by inflation eroding the Scottish budget, the limited fiscal powers of this Parliament, and the refusal of the UK Tory Government to either increase the resources available to Scottish ministers or devolve those powers necessary to deliver for the people and communities of Scotland in these challenging times? And can he advise of his engagement with business and trade unions throughout the emergency budget review process?
Deputy First Minister.
On the question of dialogue with business and trade unions, we've obviously taken forward a number of discussions with business and trade unions. I've held business roundtables myself. I met with a whole range of trade unions to hear their views and their perspective on these questions, and it's informed the conclusions that we've come to. Mr Gibson raises a key observation about the limited scope that I have to take a different course of action, because the budget for each financial year is largely fixed unless the United Kingdom Government changes its position. And obviously, I have made the case to the United Kingdom Government to recognise the unprecedented effect of inflation in this financial year. There has been no financial year under devolution in which we've come anywhere close to the inflationary pressures that we are facing, and that merits an intervention which I have asked the United Kingdom Government to undertake.
Okay, we've got 8 further speakers in 7.5 minutes in this session, so I'm going to have to speed up both the questions and indeed the answers. Deputy First Minister. Douglas Lumsden.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has received specific Barnett consequentials this financial year for things like the UK Government's Housing Support Fund. However, the Scottish Government has not always been transparent on how this money has been spent. Could the Deputy First Minister commit to publishing information on how the Scottish Government has spent all consequential funding it has received throughout this financial year?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, how consequential funding works is that the UK Government takes its decisions, the money is transferred to the Scottish Government, and we publish in extraordinary detail our budget plans, the autumn budget revision and the spring budget revision to give a complete picture during the financial year. Mr Arthur will be going to committee shortly once the autumn budget review is published to explain its contents, but I've also come to Parliament with 2 additional substantive financial statements in early September and today, transparently setting out what the Government is doing with all the resources available to us.
John Mason, to be followed by Paul Sweeney.
Thank you. Can the Deputy First Minister confirm that this statement is based on the assumption that Westminster will not either increase or decrease our block grant in the current year, 22-23, and if they were to do that on the 17th of November, what would happen?
Deputy First Minister.
This statement is predicated on the fact that we receive neither an increase nor a decrease in the funds we expect to receive from the United Kingdom Government. That risk is not just apparent on the 17th of November. That risk also extends until the moment at which the United Kingdom Government undertakes its supplementary estimates, the date for which I am not yet certain. So there is risk involved in all of this. There could be an upside, but equally there could be a downside. But I have to take decisions to properly set out the budget choices the Scottish Government is making, and at times I have to do that without the complete picture of information that ordinarily would be available to me.
Paul Swinney, to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I note the Deputy First Minister's comments regarding the potential impact of the imminent UK fiscal statement on our devolved tax policies and his intention to wait until we hear that statement itself to consider further discussion on tax. But if I could push him ever so slightly on this, there are a number of underutilised devolved tax options which we should be fully considering that could generate revenue to invest in the areas outlined today, which are stretched so thin. So will the Deputy First Minister commit in principle to a comprehensive review of devolved tax policies within the gift of the Scottish Parliament following the UK Government's fiscal statement?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I have to do that because I have to set tax rates on an annual basis, so that will be undertaken. If there are particular propositions that Mr Swinney would like me to consider, I would be very happy to receive them in writing, or I could meet with him and hear the points that he would like to put to me.
Michelle Thompson, to be followed by Ross Greer.
The Cabinet Secretary is faced with two aspects of risk of particular concern. Firstly, the uncertainty created by chaotic UK Government economic policies, and secondly, the undoubted harm about to be inflicted on the average citizen come the Chancellor's autumn statement. That the Chancellor has taken advice from George Osborne, the architect of austerity, is no comfort on either front. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore indicate the basis of discussions with the latest UK Chancellor, or indeed if he's been consulted with him by him at all?
Deputy First Minister.
I've had initial discussion with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the approach to the November the 17th statement. That has not in any shape or form covered substantive details. I have been promised substantive engagement before the UK statement, and obviously I will make myself available for any of that dialogue at any opportunity.
Ross Greer, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Further to that answer, could I ask the Cabinet Secretary what response he's received from the UK Government to the Scottish Government's specific requests that the financial settlement for this current year be inflation-proofed?
Deputy First Minister.
I have not had a positive response to that yet, despite the fact we have asked for that on a number of occasions. Kate Forbes asked for that issue to be addressed in the summer before she went on maternity leave. I reiterated that. The First Minister has made that point, and I will continue to stress that point because this, as I said in one of my earlier answers, this is a year quite without precedent of the scale of inflationary pressures. And ordinarily, if inflation is 2 or 3%, is not really going to cause much of a financial strain. Inflation at 10% is a real financial strain, and the Criminal Justice Committee this morning heard evidence from the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service about the issues that a public service like the Prison Service is wrestling with. So the point that Mr Greer makes to me, and which I will be taking to the UK Government, is an entirely valid point of view.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With the key levers to address the cost of living crisis, in the hands of the UK Government, the Scottish Government is severely constrained in terms of the funding which is available to it to take action to support people in Scotland, including my Great Inverclyde constituency. This clearly shows the deficiencies of the current fiscal framework. Does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that the full suite of powers available to an independent Scotland, that this Parliament would have been able to more fully deal with and mitigate the cost crisis?
Deputy First Minister.
There are very clearly constraints on what we are able to do, because our budget largely is fixed because of the nature of the arrangements that we face. So Mr McMillan makes the fair and reasonable point that there are a range of other powers and responsibilities that could be used to provide us with much greater flexibility in addressing the challenges that we face.
Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Deputy First Minister has announced spending reprioritisation worth £400 million across health and social care portfolios. This includes cuts to mental health and primary care spending. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister whether the Scottish Government has carried out an analysis on the impact of these cuts to those receiving mental health treatment or primary care funding, and where exactly this money is to be taken away from?
Deputy First Minister.
President Officer, as I explained in my answer to Alec Cole-Hamilton, the issues will vary in different budget lines in relation to mental health. The budget will not be increasing as fast as we had hoped and wanted to ensure. In relation to some of the work around about primary care, we will be asking for reserve funding that is held by health and social care partners to be used as an early priority rather than it being retained while further strain is carried by public funds. I would point out to Mr Stewart that we are having to do this because of the severe financial pressure applied to us by the mismanagement by the United Kingdom Government of the public finances and the economy, where inflation has been allowed to rage rampant across our society. So those are the hard choices that we have got to address as we deliver on the expectations of members of the public. And in relation to the impact on members of the public, we have published an equality assessment which addresses many of the issues that Mr Stewart raises with me.
And as briefly as possible, Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The rising cost of living is having a substantial impact on families across Scotland, and so far the UK Government has failed to provide any certainty to families on low incomes. Does the Deputy First Minister agree that the UK Government should give a clear commitment in its upcoming fiscal statement that social security benefits will be increased in line with inflation?
As briefly as possible, Deputy First Minister.
I think that would help members of the public facing the acute challenges. Obviously, we've taken decisions to boost the support available to families facing financial hardship, and I would encourage the UK Government to do likewise.
Thank you very much indeed. That concludes the statement. We move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 6523 in the name of Craig Hoy on National Care Service viability. I would ask members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. I would encourage members who are leaving to do so as quickly and as quietly as possible. And I call on Craig Hoy to speak to and move the motion. Mr Hoy, for up to 7 minutes, please.